This presentation is actually constructed from an MA dissertation I recently did, and it will present some findings from interviews that I had with people in the field, so teachers, publishers, well-known coursebook writers, as well as some research into usage of songs and song lyrics in EFL coursebooks. I originally hypothesized that there'd been significant change in attitudes to and use of the resource, and I sought to discover, if it was so, why that had been. The talk won't be too theoretical. Hopefully it'll be firmly rooted in the practical. There aren't any songs in the talk, so if you're hoping for some songs throughout, you've missed out. But there is an activity. So if you look on the handout that I just gave you, on the other side, the one with virtually nothing on it, during the course of the slide, just to keep you entertained, there are some song titles. Okay, they're in the headings, mostly, one or two bits of cheating. If you can find those, and as you go along, think if you can think which artist came out with that song, just to keep you entertained on another level, I think, as well. And we'll go through that at the end. Hopefully there'll be time for that. So it's very much a multitasking presentation. So might be a bit of a clue there, just to get you going. So I don't think it's good enough to just say that songs aid L2 teaching. You might feel we know this, but through our teaching in our institutions and from student feedback. But let's have a very brief look at what some theorists have said in the area. Tim Murphy, who in many ways is the kind of godfather, I don't know if that's the right term, holds the belief that songs predated and possibly evolved into speech. Further, someone called Gabriela Konobzyniski, quite difficult to pronounce, believes that in some cultures, knowledge of song precedes language. For example, many children have listened to songs in a foreign language through the media, etc., before they've heard the language spoken in any other way. This chap called Dwayne Eng did a kind of historical summary into writing on the topic of using songs and song lyrics in EFL, and he concluded that songs provide an excellent opportunity for what he called subvocal involuntary mental rehearsal. I think what he means there is prior preparation, rehearsal before any L2 speaking takes place. Dr. Karen Ludka believes that there's evidence from a variety of sources to suggest that using songs as pedagogical material can be very effective. Medina concurs with this, saying that the integration of music in the second language classroom can enhance overall language acquisition. The previously mentioned Eng believes that excuse me, there's a gap in teacher pedagogical research supporting the use of music in language learning since the 1990s. So really lamenting the loss of it recently there. And finally, the well-known Frida Mishan talked of the role that music can play within teaching methodologies. Talking about TPR, the total physical response, she highlighted that students can actively participate in songs not just by singing it, but also by reinforcing the meaning of the words through actions, sounds, and cognitive engagement. So the general wisdom then is that songs are, I think, authentic and motivating ways to learn. That's good. Okay. But my sneaking suspicion is that songs and song lyrics are disappearing from EFL coursebooks, and perhaps from the classroom too. So I think that this study is quite an important one. There doesn't seem to have been any previous research into the use of this resource. And so no research into whether attitudes to and use of songs and song lyrics is changing. So this was conducted in order to investigate. So where did it all begin? Well, perhaps the use of songs and song lyrics mirrors that of popular music itself, coming along and beginning in the 1960s or so. It probably came to prominence because of communicative language teaching, otherwise known, AKA, the communicative approach. I think that really, under the communicative approach, songs and song lyrics were one of the kind of natural ingredients. I mean, if you went on a teacher training course, as I'm sure many of you did originally for a CELTA, a Delta, or whatever, were songs and song lyrics used? Yeah? For most, that would be true. So it's hardly surprising then, I think, that songs and song lyrics featured heavily in 70s course books, and then moving into the 1980s with market leaders like Headway and Matters. And the trend kind of continued into the 90s with ones like Inside Out, English File, Cutting Edge. And really, I think that they've long formed a staple part of the EFL teacher's diet. And you can see the people up here enjoying tucking into a book or two. So nothing lasts forever. Change is the only constant and all this. It seems, though, that the use of this resource is on the wane. But I had to think of a way of actually testing this hypothesis to see if it's actually correct. So I titled my dissertation, Have Attitudes to and Use of Songs and Song Lyrics Changed in Recent Years? The problem was really how to satisfactorily answer the kind of two questions that are part of that title there. First of all, I pondered if I could ask students. I wondered if there was some kind of way of conducting a kind of longitudinal study of students' use of songs and song lyrics. I couldn't really see a way of doing that because students study for a small amount of time. It seemed to require a time machine, and I don't seem to have one of those. I'm fresh out of one of those. So actually, students didn't figure. So I then decided on what I've called a three-pronged attack. First of all, interviews with those in the field, or foot soldiers, as I've sort of rather patronisingly called them. These were actually teachers that I know, colleagues. Colleagues or good friends. There's all sorts of things happening today. I also made contact with textbook and coursebook writers and publishers also, who I've called players in the field. And then I did an analysis of course books and textbooks. Clearly, it's not good enough to just think that, well, modern textbooks don't seem to have it. I had to look into a little bit more depth about that. Helping with the titles at all? Is anyone doing that? So which foot soldiers did I interview? Well, I wanted some real qualitative data. So I interviewed these long-standing tutors, good friends of mine, colleagues. They had an interest in what I was doing and had no problem with giving me some of their time. So I wanted to find out about their use of songs and song lyrics, both then and now. I wanted to find out about their views on songs and song lyrics, whether they'd noticed any changes in attitudes to and use of the resource, and about the nature of those changes. The interviews were, as interviews are, especially with people you know, quite personalised, quite good fun, really. I asked them if they still used the resource, why they used it, why not, what they thought was happening, what they thought was going on, etc. Rather mysteriously, I've given them the names X, Y, and Z, and actually they emailed me to say which they'd prefer to be. They were already assigned it already, you know. So, you know, one of them said that interviewee X sounded more mysterious, you know. So another one that said interviewer Z sounds like he's asleep, and he'd quite like to be that one. And the guy that did critical thinking said, can I be interviewee Y, for obvious reasons. Very brief information about them. As you can see, they're all male. The first one was very interested in the topic generally. I'd actually had an interview with him previously for something I was doing. I had to shelve that, but his level of interest and knowledge made it very clear that he would be a good person to interview. Another person there, the second person, interviewee Y, been teaching for many years, lots of lengthy stints teaching abroad. Obviously, because of his age, you can see how he fits into the kind of CLT, communicative approach. And interview Z, who was very familiar with teaching Muslim students, as well as lots of stints in the UK and likewise. So which players? I'm sure they'll be delighted with that term. So there's a bit of background to this, really. It all started about a year ago, last year at IATEFL 2013 at Liverpool. I attended a talk by someone called Simon Andrews. And it was one of those talks that you don't really plan to go to, you just walk into, and you're meant to be there. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about from this one. But the things he had to say got me thinking about, why I'd noticed already that there weren't many being used in course books, and the things he said got me thinking about why songs and songlets were employed less in course books, and more on that later. But after that, the idea began to emerge, and I got in touch with people who I felt might have interesting views on the issue. Originally, it was a bit of a mail shot. Obviously, if you don't know people, you just know them as names. You send them an email. Some of them get back to you, some of them don't, for different reasons. But in the end, I got in touch with half a dozen or so people in the industry, sort of writing, producing, and editing course books. Some of the people were as follows. There's David Hill, who has written lots of books and is very interested in songs especially and cultural issues. And his most recent book is Traditional Folk Songs. It's probably the only book out there that is totally based on using songs for lessons. I don't know if anyone's seen that. But a fairly recent book, a couple of years old. Also got in touch with Lindsay Clanfield, who you might have seen last night. He's the author of Global. Vaughan Rees, who's one of the authors of Inside Out, and some other people mentioned down the bottom, including Gilly Cunningham, who does a relatively recent book, Face to Face. So I was persistent and lucky, I think, to get in touch with these people, and they were very helpful. And I think they didn't really need to help me the way they did, and because they did, in the old style, I've given them little gold stars, look, just like at school. So both sets of interviews, that's with the teachers and the people involved in producing books, had a basic purpose. So here's what I tried to find out from respondents. A variety of questions were asked. First of all, whether they thought that it was a question of changing interests and appetite of teachers, or whether it was amongst students, or a bit of both. Whether it was a change in the needs of the students, or just a kind of perceived change coming from the teachers. In regard to cultural sensitivities, things clearly have changed since the 1970s and on. Whether it was to do with cultural sensitivities or an increase in the awareness of such things. Whether it was to do with copyright. Some people were even suggesting it would be solely to do with copyright, but that's not what I found. Or whether it was some other factor that I haven't kind of covered as yet. So the last prong of the attack was the rather less glamorous task and a more laborious task of looking through a whole bunch of course books. How to do that? It's not rocket science. I raided my shelves, colleague shelves, the LRC, Language Resource Centre, in my department. And bearing in mind what I'd heard from Simon Andrews, who talked about the difference between the old guard of books and the more modern style, which he called the new breed, and we'll come to that more on that later. So I found 15 titles from what could be considered the older style of textbook, and decided that was probably fairly representative, so 15 older books, and then matched it up with 15 titles that could be considered kind of new breed. Not very scientific, I'm sure, but if you look through the list, very briefly, do any of these books ring a bell as experienced English teachers? And I don't think there's an enormous amount missing, but it just did happen to be what I found. The research was a bit flawed because sometimes it was just a question of finding one book at one level, and that might not have had songs in it, or might have had at another level. The opposite might have been true. But if the publication kept going throughout the time, then I made it my duty to look out for a newer copy to see if anything had changed there. So the results, now this slide is almost impossible to see, but that's why I've done the handout. And if anyone did get one, there should be some left on the back. So if you look at the handout, in the first column is books that range from 1983 to 2002. This roughly concurred with when Simon Andrews saw a kind of sea change coming amongst course books. The titles are either put down as yes, no, or not applicable. Very simply, that's did they contain material related to songs and song lyrics? Yes or no. And non-applicable are ones that were looked at for a different time period. So if you look at that list there, 1983 to 2002, you'll see that of the 15 books from the so-called Old Guard, 7 of the 15 contained ones that had material based on that. The next period was what Simon had called the sort of the new breed, and you'll see that it's gone down slightly in number during this time period, where of the 15 books that I found from that time period, 5 contained examples of use in songs and song lyrics. Where possible, if I found more than one copy, then I certainly did try and check that. The last one is a much more recent one, and because it's so recent, it actually involved talking to people about what they intended to do. Do you think any future editions are going to have anything in them or not? And of this list, the only sort of definites, and there's even one proviso there, was English File. I talked to the managing editor of English File, and he said, yes, we are committed to using songs and song lyrics as part of what we do, as part of our methodology. Inside Out does in its latest copy, but I talked to the author, that's one of the authors, Vaughan Rees, and he said, and I put it down there with a question mark, that future inclusion seems unlikely. And we'll look at the reasons for that in a minute. There are some other, there's also an asterisk. The asterisk is based on who I got to talk to, so it doesn't mean this is gospel, but someone from Cutting Edge said that the next edition will almost certainly not feature, as did someone from Headway. And I talked very briefly to Liz Soares the other day, who seemed to concur with that. And exactly the same also with the face-to-face author. So then we have a drop down to 2. So from 7 out of 15, or if you like percentages, 47%, now going down to 2 out of 15, and even then, one of those saying that the next one will not feature almost certainly. There is also an X there, which is a sort of one that's slightly different, which is Paul Sellingson's English ID, which is, I don't know if you've seen the book, but it includes little kind of rhyming couplets or little clips from song titles, but nothing done from that as far as I could notice in the sample copy that I had. Okay, so definitely going down. So out of the three-pronged attack came, it seemed to me, 3 main reasons for what was going on. And the first one is very general reason, really, that overlaps the other 2 reasons. But there is some reasons for considering it to be separate. So changing attitudes, cultural factors, cultural reasons, and things to do with copyright. So the next few slides, really, are based on quotations from the different respondents in these categories. I mean, firstly, we had a kind of more positive view of the way things were, and then other people came out with a more, sort of maybe more realistic take on it. One of the respondents saying that basically what's happened is the environment we work in has become more bureaucratic across the board, and he was talking in the context of then it being very difficult to, with exams and syllabuses, very difficult to incorporate this resource. David Hill there said that in the 1970s, 80s and 90s, teachers felt freer in general about experimenting with anything and everything. I don't know if he was just talking about in the classroom there. He didn't clarify that. So. One of my respondents, one of the teachers, pointed out, optimistically what it means to the student. And he said, it amazes me how music still resonates with overseas people. It was very emotional, very powerful language he was using. This is from Vaughan Rees, the author of Inside Out, who said that I've been in the classroom 30 years and students have always responded enthusiastically to language activities based on songs. The other side was a more, not necessarily negative, but maybe a more realistic take. One of the respondents saying, the students, in his opinion, still get the same pleasure in songs, but we as teachers are maybe more nervous about using them. Once again, this was based on the 3 teachers were all presently teaching in the UK, so culturally it might be a bit different. The next respondent talked about appetite and actually was relatively alone in saying that he believed that appetite amongst students has decreased. The reasons he gave for that was he said that more and more students are driven by specific goals. And you can see how the publishing world has responded to that. Although there's the question of, is that the way it works? Does it work that way or does it work the other way? And he carried on to say, because he's a big proponent, big user of songs himself, but very realistic guy, I think, songs can be relevant and should be, but maybe students don't think they are. And I had to add to that, the communicative approach and its inherent teaching methodologies are perhaps no longer held in such reverence. Presumably most of them students. So cultural reasons. Here I divided this up into the way it was and the way it is. Oh, mustn't do that anymore, mustn't move. Previously, one of the respondents said that, that cultural awareness didn't really raise its head. It's not something that he considered. A different respondent said that basically in the classroom, teachers felt much freer in general to do what they liked than they do now. And then even though the factor of culture came up, one of the respondents saying that songs carry a lot of culture with them. And that was said, I think, in a positive way, although, of course, you've got the negative side of that, the sort of cultural imperialistic side of what songs might be telling people from different cultures. Another respondent said that, in his opinion, songs will always be a way into British culture. So obviously the same kind of positive take on that. The way it is now, though, that varied quite a bit. One of the respondents saying songs are the first thing to go. It's part of political correctness, he believed. And adding quite an interesting comment, I think, maybe it's slightly embarrassing sitting in class and listening to a song and thinking, is everybody comfortable with this? I think there can be little doubt that care needs to be taken with songs. You know, they're culturally loaded items. But another respondent said that, and this is quite an interesting peek into the future, I'm sure you've picked up a lot from this year, I don't expect to see them, songs in books in the future, before adding, but do we expect to see books in the future? Another colleague, not on the slide, I actually had this conversation sort of passing her, and she said to me, and I wrote it down, I said, can I use it? And she said, yeah. Some of my students, often Saudi or Muslim, would ask if there was music in the lesson, and they would leave the room when it began. I had to rethink my lessons or just omit this resource. Coming back again to Simon Andrews, which is he's the person from which this all started out. He says that he believes in relation to the use of songs and song lyrics in course books, that the choice of songs in previous course books that he was talking about was hugely restricted culturally, but had great resonance with that culturally limited audience. He carried on to say, songs were tremendously motivational as long as young and not so young learners were familiar with and admired a particular popular culture, but that the importance of this particular aspect falls away the more English becomes global. The singers and songs and their contexts become less and less compelling the more remote we are from that once bonding and inspirational cultural setup. So really interesting insight, I think, there. There was a lot of discussion, needless to say, on the issue of copyright. Some, as I said before, even suggesting that it might be, you know, people said to me, oh, it's just copyright. And that was, oh, okay, I won't bother to do anything on that then, if it's just copyright. But there's no doubt that it plays a huge issue, a huge practical issue. The experienced author, David Hill, basically summing it up by saying that, you know, the copyright is nowadays a nightmare and very costly. English File Managing Director talked of some of the problems, such as copyright complications, ease of access to song lyrics via the net, and difficulty in finding appropriate songs for classroom use. It's just getting quite difficult in lots of different ways. Yeah. Okay. Gilly Cunningham just pointed out very, very, very clearly, I think, very succinctly, it's not worth the grief of finding a song that fits the theme, only to find out you can't have it or it's too expensive later on. So you need to find it in advance. Vaughan Rees, that there's now less freedom to manipulate the lyrics, leading to songs becoming much less prevalent. He was talking mostly, I think, about digital rights there. And now there's a limitation into what kind of activity you can actually do in a book with a song. Back to the English File managing editor, he didn't allow me to name him, but he said that permission to reuse songs is expensive, clearing rights is time-consuming, and this has become more difficult with the demand for course material to be delivered on different media. Although you can see he is from English File, and English File, thank you, English File is the publication that intends to carry on using this resource. And Simon Andrews also talking about English File, which is, I think, the most interesting book to talk about because they're the one committed to carrying on using this resource. He said that English File went to some lengths to get round the copyright laws because they, that's the songs, were considered quite central to their methodology, which I think that the managing editor has pointed out also. Is anyone still doing this, by the way? Because there's some quite big clues in the title. And we will have time to go through it, I think, because I'm nearly done. So coming to a conclusion, perhaps rather predictably, there are very much two sides to the story. I think it's fairly clear that, unfortunately, the writing is on the wall, for those of us that can bear to look, for the reasons we've looked at, and especially the straightforward issue of well, not straightforward, but copyright complications. But the fact remains, I think, that for us as teachers, writers, and EFL professionals, we hold pretty strong views. I mean, you're here today probably because it's a subject that really interests you. And I've got some nice quotes here, I think, that show the strength of the emotion from my interviews. And as I've been doing all the way through, I shall read this out to you. Music is universal. People have loved it throughout history. I don't think that's ever going to change. If EFL materials don't reflect this, then that's a very sad state of affairs to be in. You might work out what's coming up here, actually, from the pictures. And another quote there, where one of the respondents just basically said, we're losing a lot. We're actually throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So what I'd say to you, to conclude, or nearly conclude, is I'd implore you to carry on using in whatever way you can, songs and song lyrics, and to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Who could throw such a thing? So here's a very brief bibliography, a few items of many that were involved in the research that I've done. I'm quite happy to send that out to people. I can't, for obvious reasons, I can't send out the whole presentation if you're interested, but I'm quite happy to send out the bibliography. And in a while, I mean, I think there's a couple of minutes left, so I can take any questions or any comments. But if you'd like to get in contact, the first one there is my private email, the second one is my work email. And I'm going to leave you with a little cartoon, but I know that my son and daughter are going to be watching this, so I'm going to say to them now, Ali, my 9-year-old boy Ali, you can't watch this now, okay, and Sophia, so you must put your hands over your eyes, because this is a bit naughty, okay, so. Okay, so ending with a cartoon. Does anyone know where that's from? The lyrics? It certainly is. Do you remember which track? Okay, and there's a little caption to go with it. I thought you'd like that. It's worth coming just for that, no? So I've had to give a reference there. I couldn't give a reference for the cartoon, but yeah, it's from the Sex Pistols' Anarchy in the UK. We've got a couple of minutes left. Any questions, or we can go through the song titles, if anyone's been doing that. Yeah, good. I knew there'd be somebody who did it. Great, good. So you've got to do the titles, and then you've got to work out what goes with it. So anybody for the first one that came across? Good. Bye. Great, well done. The second one? Good. Bye, obviously. Elvis, and others covered it, I think, but certainly the King. Bit trickier. Fairly recent, from an older band, but fairly recent. Actually, there was two artists. I Googled it. I knew about the Echo and the Bunnymen track, but I Googled and they said that I think American band Maroon 5 did it as well. Easy one? The Who, yeah. Next one? Good. Bowie, good. Very tricky next one. There's one before that. That is right, but there's one before that. Showing my age and musical preferences. There's a track called Read It in Books. Yeah? Teardrop Explodes. Check them out. Blast from the Past. Next one. 1, 2, 3. Which was by? Okay, it's like a 60s track by, it's kind of northerny soul kind of thing. By Len Barry. Probably spelt wrong, actually. Next one. Someone said it. The Way It Is, yeah. Do you remember that one? 80s. Should get it after the 80s revival thing the other night. Hugh Lewis and the Music. It's got to number 1, actually. Oh, giving you the answer there. But that was by The Doors. And lastly, this was the hardest one of all. This really is below the belt. I'm being particularly nasty because it's that one. I did do them all in italics to kind of... I think several people did it, but these are a couple of the artists that have done a track. So thanks very much. There's no question time left, is there? Is there? Does anyone want to ask a question? Quite happy. Okay, well, thanks very much. Hope you enjoyed that. Thank you. Thanks so much.